The failure to meet the demand for factor VIII and so have to import 60% at a cost of £5 million a year is remarkable because Britain pioneered the concept of the volunteer blood transfusion service.
Given that we have over 1 million people who give blood every year, why did we fail to provide enough of the raw material?
Well, I think in many ways the estimates of what was required escalated very rapidly, more rapidly than the transfusion service was able to accommodate. And of course there was the problems with respect to the ability to fractionate all the material that could have been collected from transfusion centres.
But doesn't it seem that somebody somewhere made a mistake in the sense that we should have made such a tremendous underestimate of the amount that will be required? Like the difference between 1/3 and 2/3?
Yes, well, I don't think you can pin mistakes on things. I mean, this is the development of medicine. You may say that we were slow to react to the situation, but I think one has to recognise now that there is an urge to correct this situation.
But do you think, therefore, that there are people who are to blame for what is now happening as far as the haemophiliac population is concerned in AIDS?
I could give you an angry answer. I think that those politicians who pretended that we could be self-sufficient in the early days, pretended that the resources behind the blood transfusion service were sufficient to make us self-sufficient. If blame lies anywhere, then it lies with them. What's
your reaction been to the fact that haemophiliacs have started to die in this country from using the imported factor VIII?
Total horror. I mean, I actually don't distinguish between different groups of AIDS sufferers in my sympathy for them. It's an appalling disease. I don't actually have views which say it's some kind of judgment on the conduct of homosexuals and so on, but it has to be said that in the case of a haemophiliac who has a serious health hazard already, he actually acquires the infection as a result of medical treatment, which is an appalling thought. I'm glad that so few have so far died. I'm sorry that so many have been infected, and that is the reason why we're driving on with the investment at Elstree, and we're driving on with every other step we can to get the collection of blood made safer.
While you've been Minister of Health, we've continued to import more and more of the product from these dubious donors.
That's right, because it's the only available source. Without factor VIII, obviously, the haemophiliacs would be even more serious risk. But we realised, and I certainly realised, this is a very worrying situation, that we're buying factor VIII from sources where we cannot guarantee its purity.
Once the test for infection by the AIDS virus has proved positive, the worry for haemophiliacs is waiting to see if they will develop the killer disease. In Newcastle, for 71 out of 93 severe haemophiliacs, the test was positive. At St Thomas's Hospital in London, it proved positive for 120 out of 150.
As far as they themselves are concerned, it's a pretty shattering thing to have to live with, because although, as a doctor, looking at the American evidence, I can assure them that 90–95% chances that they're going to be perfectly all right. The adults, at least, have got to make fundamental changes in the way that they live, particularly with a view to their sexual lives, because of this marker in their bloodstreams. So it's not a very nice thing to have to tell patients and their families.
Just how real is the risk of transmitting AIDS has been highlighted by the case of American Patrick Burke. He contracted AIDS from using contaminated factor VIII. Before this was diagnosed, he transmitted the AIDS virus to his wife, who now has symptoms of the disease. She, in turn, passed on the virus to their son, born last year. The boy has now developed AIDS.
What exactly is the risk that, in fact, someone who has the AIDS virus could transmit it to their wife or girlfriend or to a child?
The figures amongst haemophilics are very scanty, but generally speaking, I think from American data, one is thinking in terms of about 5% transmission rate to sexual partners.
So it's obviously a very real risk.
It is a risk.
The first evidence of that risk in Britain was confirmed this weekend. The wife of a Newcastle haemophiliac has contracted AIDS.
It's a gamble, you may be one of the unfortunate ones. In anything, there's a small percentage risk, you know, that we're going to lose one or two. Well, that's fair enough. I can come to terms with that. My quality of life is such that I've no wish to lower it.
I suppose AIDS, of course, is such a dramatic new development that inevitably you're going to think, well, it doesn't take too long before you realise it's a small risk. Okay, it's another risk on top of hepatitis risk and all the other sort of risks. But the certainty that I know what would happen to myself, my body, if I didn't take the treatment material, that there's no speculation about that. That's not even a risk, that's a certainty.
Ironically, haemophiliacs are facing up to the threat from AIDS just when the goal of self-sufficiency in factor VIII for Britain seems to be at hand. At Elstree, the new plant to supply all Britain's needs is nearing completion at a final cost of £35 million. Production will start next year and full capacity should be reached in early 1987, 10 years after self-sufficiency was first promised. Once that target is reached, imports from dubious donors should end. But already, doubts are being expressed about whether that will happen. The worry centres on the vital raw material, plasma. The blood transfusion service is confident it can supply 2/3 of what is required from existing donors. But Elstree will have to rely for the other third on a new process for collecting plasma, plasmapheresis. Blood is taken from a donor, but only the plasma is retained. The red cells are returned. For Elstree to be fully supplied, plasmapheresis centres must be operating in every one of the 14 regions in England and Wales. But with 18 months to go, only half the regions have even started plasmapheresis. The total output by this method is less than 10% of what will be required if Elstree is to operate at full capacity.
Regional health authorities have many priorities for expenditure. And in some, the expenditure to provide plasma for self-sufficiency has gone on faster than in others. But I think each regional health authority and its transfusion centre is fully aware of the problem and the target date of 1987.
Even though they may not have done too much about it?
At the moment, yes.
I mean, wouldn't it be a tremendous failing on the part of the blood transfusion service if all the money, the £35 million that's to be spent at Elstree, was spent, and in 1987, when it was in full production, the blood transfusion service couldn't provide the raw material?
Oh, indeed. That would be an unpleasant situation.
What would your reaction be if, after having spent £35 million, which I think is the biggest single commitment that this government has made into the National Health Service as a capital project, we still have to import factor VIII?
I'd be quite appalled. But we have planned throughout on the basis that this was going to achieve self-sufficiency. Obviously, 95% self-sufficiency would be disappointing and would contain an element of risk in it, unless we found some new, totally safe source of supply. But at the moment, I think our plans are well-founded. I don't anticipate those problems. I see that the danger, the risk is there. I think we've done everything possible to safeguard against it. And at the moment, I'm not anticipating that we are going to have a shortfall in 1987.
The government is confident that this time self-sufficiency will be achieved, although 10 years later than forecast. But the history of Factor VIII, a story of missed opportunities, mistakes and decisions taken too late, for which the British haemophiliac and the taxpayer have paid a high price, makes some doctors sceptical.
But certainly in terms of Factor VIII, there will be a continuing shortfall until the supply of material copes with the demand of the material and the projected demand, and thus there will always be a use for commercially available material in this country until these conditions are satisfied.
They have not put resources of staff and finance into the procurement of plasma within the regions. So although it's suggested by government that Elstree will make us self-sufficient, unless source plasma is made available, it can't be self-sufficient, and we are still going to be dependent upon the importation of blood product from the United States.